Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series bringing you the voices, ideas, and research of distinguished faculty who are shaping the world of business and beyond. I am Deepak, your host from India. Today we have a truly special guest with us, Dr. Jessica Green. Before we begin, allow me to introduce the guest for today's episode. Dr. Jessica Green is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, with cross appointments at the School of Environment and the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. A leading voice on the ground politics of climate change, her research sits at the intersection of politics, policy, and law, exploring who holds power in world politics and how that power shapes our ability to address the climate crisis. Dr. Jessica earned her PhD from Princeton University, Master of Public Administration from Columbia University, and a BA in Public Policy from Brown University. Before joining the University of Toronto, she held faculty positions at Case Western Reserve University and New York University. Her first book, Rethinking Private Authority, earned Best Book awards from the three prestigious international associations, including the American Political Science Association. She is also a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. Dr. Jessica's research has earned a place in some of the world's most respected journals, Nature, Nature Climate Change, and international organizations. And her expertise continues to inform public discourse through the New York Times and the Global and Mail. It is a true honor to welcome Dr. Jessica Green, author of the landmark book Existential Politics: Why Global Climate Institutions Are Failing and How to Fix Them. A courageous and incisive examination of the gaps in our global climate governance and the urgent reforms needed to bridge them. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Green to the podcast. Professor Jessica, we deeply appreciate your gracious acceptance of our invitation. It is an honor and privilege to host you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Deepak.
Thank you. Professor, your book opens with a striking claim that the climate crisis is evidence of an incredible governance failure. For someone who might assume we have simply lacked political will, how would you explain the deeper diagnosis you offer in Existential Politics?
Sorry, can you say it one more time?
Yeah. So how would you explain the deeper diagnosis you offer in Existential Politics?
So the central claim of the book is that what we've been doing hasn't been working, and I think that is pretty clear to the casual observer or reader of the newspaper, because the reason that it hasn't been working is because we've been focused on the wrong problem. And the problem that has been the sort of traditional diagnosis from everyone from academics to policymakers is that climate change is a collective action problem that requires international or multilateral cooperation to reduce emissions. So emissions mitigation across countries is where we need to go. But what I argue in the book is that actually it is a problem of what I call existential politics, which is the conflict, the political and distributive conflict between types of asset owners, fossil asset owners and green asset owners. And I think you can probably guess from those categories that fossil asset owners are things like oil and gas companies and large emitters that rely, cement corporations that rely on fossil fuels and high temperatures for their products, whereas green assets are those that are, the engines of a renewable and decarbonized economy. And the reality is that climate change and climate policy are going to change the values of these assets, right? In a decarbonized world, fossil assets would become worthless, right? We don't need fossil fuels. And so those asset owners are going to fight tooth and nail to preserve the value of those assets, and that means slowing the progress of decarbonization. Whereas green asset owners are going to try to advocate for further decarbonization, but obviously the problem is a bit of a David and Goliath, although that is changing for sure and changing rapidly, that fossil asset owners far outstrip the ability of green asset owners to influence political processes because of their wealth and power. And so what we see is this conflict, I call it distributional politics on steroids, right? It is because both climate change and climate policy are going to change the value of assets such that some asset owners simply will not be in business anymore. So that's really the conflict that we're dealing with, not this traditional model that we've talked about for so many decades of multilateral cooperation to solve the collective action problem of mitigation.
Professor, you introduced the concept of managing tons versus managing assets. Can you walk us through why that distinction is so fundamental and how it changes everything about how we approach climate policy?
Yeah. So one of the sort of logical conclusions that comes from this idea of collective action on mitigation is that we need to focus on mitigation, right? We need to focus on emissions, tons of emissions, and reducing tons of emissions. And so we've developed this suite of policies which are focused narrowly on this question of this issue of what I call managing tons. And these are carbon pricing, carbon offsets, and net zero. They're all kinds of ideas centered around carbon accounting and how we measure, manage, monitor, buy, sell tons of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide. And so what I talk about in the book is that managing tons is a highly technical process, right? It requires, we know how to count money, and we've known that for, centuries, but counting carbon is something that is a very new kind of innovation, and not many people know how to do it, and it's very difficult. It requires a lot of judgment calls, and for those reasons, it privileges fossil asset owners who have the material and technical resources to really do this. And so what we see is that these managing tons policies in the end can be manipulated in ways that are favorable to fossil asset owners. And I can circle back to that in a minute. That's very different from managing assets, right? From basically thinking about the flow of dollars in the economy. So if you think that the problem is existential politics, this contest between fossil asset owners and green asset owners, the problem is not how do we reduce emissions. The problem is how do we even the playing field between fossil asset owners and green asset owners? And that won't be done by carbon accounting. It will be done, or managing tons, it will be done through changing the flow of money, dollars in the economy. And so I talk about different ways we can think about how to change the flow of dollars in the global economy in ways that both constrain the material power of fossil asset owners and sort of grow and build the material power of green asset owners.
Because you argue that climate change is, at its core, a political problem, not a technical one. But most global institutions treat as a measurement and compliance challenge. Why has this technocratic framing proven so persistent and so dangerous?
Ooh, that's a great question. That really gets at the crux of the book. I think why has it been so persistent? And why is it so dangerous? I think those two things are actually intertwined, right? It's been part of the reason. It's a long. There's a long history to that question, and I'll try and answer it a little bit briefly. But part of the reason it's been persistent is because technocratic approaches don't require rough and tumble politics, right? So for decades, economists said, well, if we just put a price on carbon, that will fix the problem, right? That will internalize the costs of emitting, and therefore we will change firms' behavior, and then we will get a decarbonization process kind of rolling. And the reason that didn't work is because the price was never high enough. And many people say, well, carbon pricing would work if the price were higher. But the price has never been high, quote unquote, high enough because of politics. Because firms will fight to, because of existential politics, fossil asset owners will fight to keep the price at a manageable size. And also, obviously, we've seen, both in the United States and here where I live in Canada, other countries too, a big backlash from the public against carbon pricing, right? Because it translates pretty transparently to higher prices for fuel and sometimes higher prices for other products, right? And nobody wants that. So basically, the politics are really malign, because what you're saying as a politician is, let's raise the prices now in this very transparent way, so you know exactly how much more this is costing you, for the possibility of a slightly less changed climate in the future. Nobody, that's just not a winning policy. And we know also from studies that carbon pricing doesn't tend to be very effective in reducing emissions. I've done some work on this. It has a minimal effect on reducing emissions. So why would you choose a policy that has a minimal effect on emissions but manages to get everybody angry? It's not a good mix. But it's been persistent because politicians can say we're doing something, and firm fossil asset owners say this is tolerable because there are kind of ways to either have carve-outs or keep the price low or use offsets such that you can implement this climate policy without radically affecting the bottom line. So I think the dangers are two. One I've talked about is this sort of malicious politics of, like, particularly with carbon pricing. The other piece of the politics that is dangerous is, like, people don't understand it. Like, what is it, if you are Walmart or, Google, and you say, we've managed to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by X%, the average person will have no idea what you're talking about. And so all of these claims can be made, or, we've gone net zero. What does that actually mean? And if it means that we're paying for tons and tons of offsets, for example, which don't actually change our business model fundamentally, then you're not really advancing decarbonization. You're just making claims about what your sort of carbon bottom line looks like. And so in that way, it is quite pernicious. And I think we've seen, particularly in the US, how quickly firms have stepped back from net zero now that they've been given political license to do that. So I think it kind of, the mask has fallen away, and we've seen that, some of these policies like net zero or carbon offsets are just window dressing, or greenwashing for many firms. Not universally. I don't want to tar everyone with the same brush, but for many firms, it is licensed to continue the status quo, and precisely because it's so technical and so complex, there's not going to be a lot of challenges to it. So I think that, that's why managing tons can be quite dangerous. And then, of course, everybody says, oh, but look, we're doing something. We're going net zero, or we put a price on carbon. And so, we sort of keep kind of bumbling along with these mediocre policies that are not actually making a dent in the real project, which is to transform the asset base of the global economy, which of course is a huge, huge endeavor.
Professor, the book frames climate politics as existential conflicts that emerge when actors face the devolution of their assets. How does this lens help explain the behavior of fossil fuel companies and electric utilities that seem to resist even modest climate reforms?
Yeah, I think, so fossil asset owners don't want climate policy to go ahead because in a decarbonized world, there's no demand for fossil assets. So, there have been studies that say that, this is what, others have referred to as the carbon bubble or the problem of stranded assets. There's I think it's in Science, the article on this estimates that by 2050, if we were to meet the Paris goals, which obviously we are not very much not on track to do. But we're looking at something like $1 trillion in stranded assets. That's a lot of money, right? And so that is why fossil asset owners are saying, what can we do to slow the pace of decarbonization, slow walk this? And these policies of managing tons have been instrumental in doing that. Just to take a brief detour here, one of the earliest managing tons policies that dates back to the 80s is carbon offsets. And this was presented as an innovation for how to help promote clean development primarily in the global south, also in heavily forested countries, to say, okay, let's pay developing countries either to keep their forests standing or to develop alternative, renewable forms of energy. And what happened, because these are very technical projects, is a lot of funny business with the accounting, a lot. And so we have, study after study has shown that offsets don't reduce emissions nearly as much as they claim to. One recent study suggests that something like 60%, they overstate emissions reductions by something around 60%. Right? So that if companies or countries are relying heavily on this policy, which has been shown to be so deeply flawed, then again we're in trouble. But this is precisely the kind of policy that allows fossil asset owners to slow the devaluation of their assets.
Professor, you point out that green asset owners, the future of the carbonized economy, are relatively few and politically weak. What would it take to shift that power imbalance? And are there any early signs of that happening?
Yeah, so a big piece of the book is sort of talking about, it's very easy to say, Exxon is the bad guy or whatever, but the real question is it's not just how do we build. So the technical response would be, we need to build out more renewable energy. But the political economy response is, well, that requires a fundamental set of transformations of social, economic, and political systems. And those things are interlocked. So you can't just, for example, a lot of engineers or climate scientists, point to the falling cost of solar or the falling cost of batteries, which is not wrong and it's great, but it's not just the cost, right? It is not a simple question of cost. There are incentives and there are political coalitions. So the question becomes not only how do we build out these technologies, but how do we build the political power of the interest groups that will advocate for the implementation of these technologies? And that has been the real challenge. There was a story in the paper, the Financial Times yesterday, about how Bloomberg has donated several $1 million to green energy lobby groups in the United States. And this is the kind of policy that we need, because we need those interests have been, they're just smaller, right? And so they need a boost. They need the government to put their thumb on the scale in order to help these technologies not just be developed, but be implemented. And the way we can think of this is that this is a public good, right? The dissemination and the conversion of societies to these new technologies, renewable technologies, is a public good. And public goods are not provided by the market. We know that. That's economics 101. So we need governments to help provide the incentives for that to happen. So there's a whole chapter in the book that talks about green industrial policy, which, listeners in the United States will be very familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the largest sort of industrial policy for climate in, in decades, perhaps ever. And that's the kind of thing that we need, where governments are investing in both subsidizing technologies for consumers, which will drive demand, but also implementing policies that will promote both manufacturing and the infrastructure required to fully deploy renewable technologies. So what I talk about in the book, so industrial policy usually happens at the national level. And I'm an international relations scholar. So what I sort of ask in the book is, okay, if you buy the argument about existential politics, and you buy the argument that we do need to promote, to invest in green technologies, what international institutions are out there to help do that? And I talk about a couple of them. One is trade. Now, I wrote this book before Trump took office and the global trading regime was turned on its head. But obviously, and we're kind of having this debate here in Canada, a global trading regime will facilitate the dissemination and diffusion of renewable technologies, right? We are not all going to become China overnight and become, global leaders in the production of renewable components and technologies. So we need to import them. And we need to figure out, every individual country needs to figure out where on the supply chain it can add value. Canada is now having this fight that the US has now punted on. First, we followed in the US's footsteps and said, we're not importing any Chinese EVs, even though they are obviously the superior low-cost technology. And now we have rolled that back a little bit and said, okay, we are going to import a fixed amount. It's not a huge amount, but I think the sentiment behind it is important, is this recognition that we need a global trading regime if we are going to decarbonize anywhere at the rate that the climate crisis demands.
Professor, carbon pricing, net zero targets, and carbon offsets are considered the gold standard of climate policy by many governments. Your book is deeply critical of all three. What is the most important thing policymakers misunderstand about why these tools fail?
Also, great question. So let me start with offsets, because I think it's a very important one. And actually, it is, even though we don't talk about it, offsets are the foundation of all policies that manage tons. So most carbon pricing, most emissions trading systems, which are different than carbon taxes, but most emissions trading systems have some provision for offsets. As I said before, most net zero plans include some use of offsets. So if offsets don't work, those other policies don't work either. So I think the thing to understand that policymakers need to understand about offsets is that what they do is sell the hypothetical absence of emissions. So what happens in a carbon offset is there is a project. Let's say it is a wind farm, right? A wind installation. And a project funder says, we're going to pay for this wind installation, which will substitute for the generation of power through natural gas. So the difference in the hypothetical world of electricity with natural gas and the actual world of electricity with wind is the amount of absence that you are buying and selling. So if somebody came to your door and said, I would like to sell you the hypothetical absence of violence or bubbles, whatever, you would say, I am not buying that. Because how do I know that that wouldn't be generated elsewhere or geographically or at some other point in time, or that even you calculated the hypothetical absence correctly? And I think that is a very, it's not an intuitive thing to think about. So if you get that number wrong, which by the way is based on projections, right? It's like what the world would have looked like if you had that gas generated electricity. if you get that number right, great, but there's a lot of ways to get it wrong, and there's a lot of reasons to cheat or massage those numbers to say, oh my gosh, these emissions would have been huge. So once we put in this wind farm, we're going to have these enormous reductions. So you overstate the reductions. And that is a really big problem, not only for offsets, but for all of these other policies that also employ offsets. And we've seen time and again, there's just coverage everywhere of all of the problems with cheating and overstating emissions reductions with offsets. It's a bad policy. And by the way, people who have studied the politics of this, like me, have been saying this for decades. So it's not new. It's just it takes a while to get this information out. And so I think that is really the biggest misunderstanding. I mean, we can go also into the details of, carbon pricing and net zero. I think there are also opportunities for massaging the numbers. They're maybe not as profound as with carbon offsets, but I think they're just like a lot of policies, not just climate related or environment related. The phrase carbon pricing or net zero masks a lot of the technical complexity. So you can say net zero, but are you talking about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? Scope 3 means that you are making a claim about all of the emissions along the supply chain of your product. So if you make a widget in India and you source from Thailand or South Africa to make that widget, then you have to know about what emissions were generated in the component parts of your widget in those other countries. That is a mammoth undertaking, so to make that claim is really impossible. It cannot be verified, or it can only partially be verified. So I think, the technical complexity of these policies of managing tons is, something that most policymakers don't understand. It's not their job necessarily to understand that, but somebody needs to tell them that this is very, again, with the backdrop of existential politics, right? That because of this complexity, there is a lot of incentive to massage the numbers.
Professor, the book is notably harsh on voluntary carbon markets and offset schemes, citing greenwashing, leakage, and unverifiable data. Given how entrenched these markets are, is there any version of them that could work, or do they need to be abandoned entirely?
Yeah, so let me just say a little bit about what voluntary carbon markets are. So when I talked about offsets can be used in a variety of policies. Often they're used in compliance policies that are created by national governments or subnational governments, and those are regulated by governments. But there's this other whole voluntary offset market, which I also refer to in the book as unregulated, because that's another way to describe them, created by NGOs and other non-state actors who are essentially printing money. I mean, if you think of an offset as a type of currency, they're saying, this is the currency, right? We printed a ton of emissions reductions, again, the hypothetical absence, right? And they have this vested interest in being, participating in this market. And so again, there are these incentives to massage the numbers. I think, and I've gone on record saying that, and I'm not the only one, by the way, saying that voluntary carbon markets cannot be fixed. There are too many incentives to massage the numbers, because these non-state actors have a vested interest in staying active, having some authority and being able to continue to print this kind of money, right? And there have been efforts. There have been two sort of big efforts to reform or improve carbon market, the voluntary carbon market. And they always sort of come up with the same thing. We need more integrity. We need more guardrails. We need more, verification and monitoring. And yet we haven't seen any market improvement in these kinds of inflating the numbers and overstating the reductions that have happened. And again, that's because everybody who is involved in the voluntary carbon market wants the numbers to add up, right? Project developers want to get their projects funded. They want to deliver the most amount of reductions for those who are paying for the projects. The monitors and the verifiers, right? So when there's an offset project, a third party has to go in and check all the boxes and say, this project is actually happening. It is reducing carbon emissions. It's reducing at the level that the project developer claims. But those monitors, get paid by the project developer. So there's an obvious conflict of interest here. It's like, the Arthur Andersen and Enron of carbon offsets. So in my mind, and I don't think there is a way to fix this. And I will add, there's another problem here, which is that the voluntary carbon market and these compliance markets have started to merge. So in a number of cases, governments have said, we will accept offsets from the voluntary market. And the biggest example of this is ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, right? There's now an agreement to not reduce, but basically cap emissions from aviation, which are not included in the Paris Agreement. And because there is no way to fly carbon-free, it relies extremely heavily on offsets. And the demand for offsets is so high that it cannot be produced by compliance markets alone. So they have turned to voluntary markets, which by the way, lobbied hard to have their offsets accepted in the agreement once the rules were being drafted. And so we're seeing, again, it's like bad money spreading throughout the economy. So we're seeing the proliferation of these very questionable offsets in lots of different regulatory environments. So I do not think that they can be reformed. And I've called for them to be basically shut down, phased out, basically to retire those credits as quickly as possible.
Professor, you propose what you call radical pragmatism, using international tax, trade, and finance institutions to rebalance power toward green asset owners. Can you give us a concrete example of how, say, a global minimum corporate tax or changes to investor-state disputes settlements could directly accelerate decarbonization?
Yeah. So radical pragmatism is basically the idea. There are many scholars and advocates who have proposed different courses of action to address the climate crisis that basically involve rethinking the capitalist system and the liberal international order. And I say in the book that those are very important conversations to be having, but they're not ones that I'm qualified to have. My comparative advantage is understanding the role of international institutions. We already have all these international institutions in place. So for me, the pragmatic piece is, what do we have already that we can leverage? And it's radical in the sense that it gets to the root of the problem, which is existential politics, which is the sort of vying for power between fossil and green asset owners, as opposed to managing tons. So a radical pragmatic approach is, as I talked about, through industrial and trade policy, is elevating the political and material power of green asset owners, but it's also, and this has been forever the elephant in the room, constraining the material power of fossil asset owners, right? We cannot just build out renewables because we have to address the supply problem. And there are many people who have spoken much more eloquently about that than I have. But for me, what I try to think about here is, how do we do that? How do we constrain them using the international institutions that we have? And I talk about two solutions. One is tax policy, and the other is investment policy. And okay, so we know that corporations around the world, not just fossil asset owners, but many, have used tax havens. They book their profits in countries where there are lower corporate taxes. This is a long-standing phenomenon. It's been growing precipitously since the 1970s. There are economists like Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman who have studied this phenomenon. And countries are losing billions of dollars, billions and billions and billions of dollars. And corporations are getting rich because they're paying much less than their fair share. So one way to just repatriate money that countries are owed is by improving tax policy. And that has actually been happening. That process was kind of unfolding as I wrote the book. The OECD put in place a corporate minimum tax, which basically says it's kind of unprecedented in global tax cooperation for countries to agree to a tax level. And I spent quite a while delving into the details of international tax policy, which is technical to say the least. But the key takeaway here is that, obviously this is a race to the bottom, right? So countries can undercut each other by slashing their corporate taxes unless they collectively agree to a minimum tax, which they did in 2021. And countries are actually implementing this. The Trump administration obviously threw a spanner in the works and has not signed on, although they have now this kind of parallel set of rules, obviously, because they can't cooperate multilaterally, heaven forbid. But actually the upshot of that parallel process is not too far from the 15% that other countries have agreed to. So this is just a way for countries to repatriate money and to take money from fossil fuel companies, which are very good at offshoring. This is a thing that they do. And I talk about, some prominent instances of this in the book. And that money comes back and maybe it's not used for climate change, but it can be used for something. Money is fungible. So that's one way to constrain the power of fossil asset owners. And the other is through investment law. And so there are provisions in mostly in bilateral investment treaties, but also in multilateral treaties like the Energy Charter, which are meant to protect fossil asset owners' investments in basically exploration and exploitation of fossil fuels. So they say things like, so for example, let's say Shell wants to explore for oil in Nigeria, and Nigeria decides that it's going to implement. Actually, let me use an example from the book, and that is from the company Rockhopper, and off the coast of Italy. Italy gave Rockhopper permits to explore for offshore oil. It began that process, or was in the planning of doing that. And then because of public outcry from the Italian citizenry, decided to ban all offshore oil drilling and prospecting. Rockhopper, under the provisions of the Energy Charter, said, we've lost money in our investment and we want it back. And this process has happened over and over again, particularly for oil and gas companies around the world. So countries have been basically Joseph Stiglitz calls this litigation terrorism, that they are too frightened to implement climate policy for fear of being sued by fossil fuel companies and having to have huge payouts under these investment provisions in international investment treaties. And so, and that's happened over and over again. The payouts have been on the order of billions and tens of billions. And so, you know, again, this is madness, right? If we're dealing with a climate crisis, to pay a fossil fuel company billions of dollars because it didn't get to extract more fossil fuels is, you know, cutting off our nose to spite our face, right? And that's, again, that's money that can't be used for other things. So the proposal in the book is, hey, let's just withdraw from those treaties, right? And that's not a difficult thing to do. You don't have to have agreement. I mean, there are some things that will slow the process because they may take a while to kick in and things like this. But countries can just say, we're not going to be part of the international, either the investment treaty or the international institution that houses these investment treaties any longer. And that will free us up to make climate policy without the fear of this litigation terrorism. So those are two ways, both through you know, taxation, which is, again, already underway, and through changes to investment treaties to constrain the power of fossil asset owners so that they can't use political power to slow the decarbonization process.
Professor, you argue that the UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation may ultimately have a greater impact on the climate than the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change itself. That's a provocative claim. What's the logic behind it? And what would have to happen for that vision to be realized?
For an international tax convention, so that's a different question, because that requires a whole new treaty. And, you know, I actually don't know what the numbers are, but most of the treaties that I've followed take at least a decade to negotiate, right? So, and we don't know what that would actually look like. I think it's an important point, right? Because the OECD is the Organization of Economic Development, and that it is a club of sort of wealthy countries, right? And a number of countries who are participating in the global corporate minimum tax have said, we would rather this process go through the UN. Often developing countries say this because it is it's universal membership, one country, one vote. So for that tax, they've had, I think, 1 or 2 prep comms at this point, preliminary meetings to discuss the scope of what that treaty would look like. And so I think we're a long ways from a tax treaty. And it's obviously impossible to say what the contours of that treaty will be at this point. It's very, very early days. So I think it's difficult to compare it to this kind of like, you know, this half-formed idea to what is actually happening in the UNFCCC. You know, I don't think we need to go through the litany of problems with the UNFCCC to say that it is, you know, not getting the job done. I guess I don't have a great answer for that question beyond saying that it could have the potential to solve a lot of problems, one of which is constraining the power of fossil asset owners, and the second of which is just to recoup money that is owed to countries. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of potential there, but we just don't know yet what's going to happen.
Professor Jessica, before we wrap up, one final question. Given the political headwinds globally, rollbacks of carbon pricing, rising fossil fuel lobbying, and geopolitical fragmentation, where do you find reason for optimism? And what is the one institutional reform you believe would move the needle the fastest?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. So what I think what I am optimistic about, kind of counterintuitively, is all of the things you describe, right? The rising cost of fossil fuels, the volatility associated with the cost of fossil fuels because of the war in Iran, have, woken a lot of firms and countries up to the fact that, like, there is a cost associated with fossil fuels that doesn't have anything to do with climate change, right? It has to do with economic security and political stability. And so, counterintuitively, my optimism is that climate is no longer a climate issue. And I sort of say something like that in the book. The problem with climate policy is that it's too focused on climate policy, right? It's now become a question of geopolitics and economic security and supply chain resilience and all these things. Now, those things can all be distorted and in very bad ways, right? And I think the upheaval to the global trading system is one example of that. But if done properly, it could also be an engine for much more rapid decarbonization, because countries will no longer be focused on, I think carbon pricing has really poisoned the well in some ways, because when people think about climate policy, all they think is, oh, my gas is going to be more expensive, right? But if we don't talk about that anymore and we just say, you could have an electric vehicle and not pay for gas, and here's a subsidy for buying that car, or public transportation is going to be, cheaper now, it's going to be subsidized, or we're going to invest more in the care economy, just paying for teachers and nurses and doctors, because those are things that are low carbon and we need, right? So I think there are lots of different ways that gives me optimism. If politicians can think about this as an opportunity to make this not about climate policy, but about sort of investing in public goods domestically, investing in making sure that, we have reliable power, that we have, reasonably priced goods. And I should add, increasingly, that we have resilience to, the effects of the climate crisis, that we plant trees in urban places, that we invest in firefighting, that we invest in, making infrastructure more resilient to floods, things like this. These are all domestic investments in public goods. People want that. They want to see improvements in their daily lives. And I think that if governments and policymakers can see climate change that way, then there's a lot of room for political progress.
Listeners, that brings us to the close of today's conversation, and what a conversation it has been. Dr. Jessica Green has given us not just a diagnosis of why our climate institutions are failing, but a genuinely new way of thinking about the politics behind them. If today's discussion has sparked something in you, I believe you pick up the Existential Politics. It is a kind of book that changed the way how you see the world. Thank you, Dr. Green, for your time, your research, and your candor. And thank you to our listeners for being a part of Business Talk. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going. Thank you so much, Dr. Jessica Green.
Thank you so much for having me.